All right, joining me to talk about all this is Kevin Warsh, former Federal Reserve Governor and visiting fellow at the Hoover Institution, who probably should have been the Federal Reserve Chairman, but who knows, the cavalry's coming. Lovely to have you. Thank you, Kevin.
Larry, it's good to be home.
So how do we end essentially 10% inflation that came today?
So it's going to require a major reversal in the broken monetary and fiscal policies that have brought us to this perilous point. Everything else we can do a little executive orders on this and that, new task forces on supply chain, but these are indicative of inflation that has been long in the making and that is now accelerating, deepening, broadening, and getting worse. And the idea that the crowd at the Fed, the same forecast they had that said that inflation would be 2.6% last year, says it's going to be 2.6% this year. I'm afraid they're going to be sadly mistaken unless they change course and fast.
Janet Yellen says it's going to be 2% by year end, but they're all in favor of legalizing marijuana, so I understand that problem. That was a joke, just saying it was a joke. But a serious matter is the only guy I hear sufficiently hawkish is Jim Bullard of the St. Louis Fed. And he's calling for faster rate hikes and I presume faster shrinking of the balance sheet. Stop buying bonds, stop repressing interest rates and so forth and so on. Put yourself down there. You're back at the Federal Reserve, okay? What would you call for? How fast should they be raising rates? Let's start there.
So they've got no time to waste. Every day and week they go by, inflation becomes more embedded. Companies and households expect it to be around longer, and they're passing it through. So I know they don't have another meeting for a few weeks, but if I were there and somehow found myself in this predicament, which frankly, I don't think I would have found myself in this predicament, but if I were there, I'd do a couple of things. One is I would say we are ending quantitative easing immediately.
Right.
A one-sentence press statement wouldn't be hard to produce and get votes on.
Intermeeting.
Today. No time like the president. 401, one sentence that says we've been buying these mortgage-backed securities and these treasuries since the pandemic. There's no reason for it. It ended today at 359. Now, would that do a lot? Well, it would show a sign.
And govies? Stop buying govies.
Treasuries and mortgage-backed securities.
Okay, the whole boat. Good.
This whole gang thinks that they better not surprise markets. But, you know, the truth is every once in a while markets need to be surprised. In this case, that there's a regime change going on, so I would do that first.
That's a great point. That's a really important point. So, you know who did that? Volcker. I always refer to Volcker because that's my experience way back when I worked for Reagan as a child. But Volcker liked to surprise markets for exactly the reason you said. There's a new sheriff in town, and here's what's going to happen, and you'll catch up to me, but here's where we're going. Why are they so afraid to do that now?
So markets have been spoon-fed for too long. Markets will be just fine as long as the economy's just fine. But the truth is the economy is not fine. Inflation is eating the real economy. Inflation is eating poor households that are looking for ways to get by on limited wages. So that's the first thing I do. The second thing I do, Larry, since you asked, is I would convene a meeting of a coalition of the willing of every global central bank that has an inflation problem, which is almost every central bank in the world. And this Sunday, we'd issue a statement. And the statement would say, there's a global inflation problem, and we are going to use all of our efforts to bring price stability to our economies. Because, again, the globe needs to know, markets need to know, there's a regime change. We issue those sorts of emergency statements on weekends. We're creating this mess. Well, it's an inflationary mess that demands the same kind of focus.
Yeah, worldwide. You know, I had Ed Hyman on, Wall Street's best economist, most popular economist, and he has been pointing out how the money supply has been rising astronomically in all these big countries, not just us. And he points out how these inflation numbers are popping up in all the countries. So this is a global issue. I think you're quite right.
That's right. We may or may not like it, but the U.S. is part of an integrated global economy.
Yep.
And what the Fed does has huge implications for what every other central bank in the world does. So I think it's about time the Fed starts leading the global central banks in the economy to quash this inflation. The longer we play slow, the longer we dance around with markets, the more embedded it is. And that means the more the Fed will ultimately have to do to kill it.
Oh, yeah.
And when they do that,
it will be worse.
it can be worse.
Rudy Dornbush, this came up in the Hyman interview. Rudiger Dornbush, if you remember him.
Of course.
I knew the guy, a very smart guy. He used to call it, the Fed will murder the economy. Right. And that's going to happen this time around, unless they act swiftly. So you could do 50 basis points intermeeting. You could do a full percentage point intermeeting.
So what I would do, again, if you stuck me there, I would do those two things to show the regime change, to explain what's happening. I would wait till the meeting in a couple of weeks, and I would get on with it, which means then you're going to have to say, we're not going to be giving perfect forward guidance. We don't know what the world looks like. We want markets to be paying attention to the data. Today we're moving 50, and we'll keep you posted as we go.
Oh, I love that. I just totally love that. That is how you change expectations. Right. You rattle the cage, and that's it. That's probably, you know, Kevin, that may be the only way they can get this done without murdering the economy. And they got to do it fast. The clock is ticking. Time's against them.
That's right.
It's a great point. Your economic outlook, just real quick. I mean, the economy is in an inflationary boom right now, but you're right. Inflation is literally eating away at wages and so forth. How long can this last?
So I think inflation is going to be higher than real economic growth in 2022. Inflation in 2022 strikes me as, unless these guys are prepared to do the murder you just referenced, inflation's going to be above 5% this year. That doesn't leave a lot of room for real economic growth, maybe a couple of percent. And it's a very different economy.
Stagflation.
Yeah, it starts to feel that way. And again, the longer this goes, the more scared these guys are, the less they're calling balls and strikes and worrying about everything else, the bigger problem they're going to have.
I don't see why inflation is lower this year than last year. I mean, the money supply is still growing 13% a year. They haven't changed that. The balance sheet, which we used to call the monetary base, is still astronomical. I mean, you could have 8 to 10% inflation. You know, it's Kevin Warsh is the one. You know, Kevin Warsh. Kevin Hassett, I beg your pardon, you're Kevin Warsh. But Kevin Hassett, who's a smart guy, says they should keep raising 50 basis points per meeting or intermeetings. Do something. See, the problem is they're not going to do much of anything. And then the inflationists in corporate land, every place else, will say, yeah, yippee, we're just going to continue to jack up prices willy-nilly because the government's asleep. It's not the working folks who are getting hurt. It's the government that's doing this. You understand? It's really a price-wage spiral is how I look at it. Yeah. Working folks trying to just keep up. I got to get a look at her. She's screaming at me, the floor manager, Nina. I'd love to have you on for longer. I like your idea. Shake them up. Don't signal. Shake them up. Is that your message?
That's the message, and the most important thing is they're trying to have a soft landing. The longer it goes, the more the landing is going to be hard and not soft.
Yeah. Kevin Warsh, folks. I didn't mean to call him Kevin Hassett, but Kevin Hassett's wonderful, and we're all friends. But this is Kevin Warsh, the Federal Reserve Kevin Warsh. Someday he'll sit at the head of the table.